The Vietnam War, also known as the Second Indochina War, was a prolonged and devastating conflict that occurred between 1955 and 1975. The war was fought between the Communist forces of North Vietnam, supported by its Communist allies, notably the Soviet Union and China, and the government of South Vietnam, backed primarily by the United States and other anti-communist nations. The U.S. involvement in Vietnam, which escalated in the 1960s, was largely driven by the Cold War doctrine of containing the spread of communism. The roots of the Vietnam War trace back to the early 20th century when Vietnam was under French colonial rule. During World War II, Japan occupied Vietnam, and after Japan's defeat in 1945, the Vietnamese nationalist leader Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam's independence. However, France sought to reassert control over its former colony, leading to the First Indochina War between French forces and the Viet Minh, a communist-led nationalist movement. This war ended in 1954 with the defeat of the French at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu and the subsequent Geneva Accords, which temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel into a communist North and an anti-communist South. The Geneva Accords called for national elections in 1956 to reunify the country, but the U.S. and South Vietnamese leader Ngo Dinh Diem refused to hold them, fearing that Ho Chi Minh would win. This decision led to increased tensions between the North and South. And by the late 1950s, a full-scale insurgency, led by the Vietcong, South Vietnamese communist rebels, was underway in South Vietnam. North Vietnam supported the Vietcong, and the conflict increasingly drew in the U.S., which saw the situation in Vietnam as a key part of the broader Cold War struggle. The U.S. initially provided military and economic aid to the South Vietnamese government under President Diem, but as the Vietcong insurgency intensified, so did U.S. involvement. The U.S. adopted a policy of containment, aimed at preventing the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. This policy was rooted in the domino theory, which suggested that if one country fell to communism, neighboring countries would follow. In August 1964, after an alleged attack on U.S. ships in the Gulf of Tonkin, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave President Lyndon B. Johnson the authority to escalate U.S. military involvement in Vietnam. By 1965, the U.S. had begun a large-scale deployment of ground troops and launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a massive bombing campaign against North Vietnam. The U.S. strategy in Vietnam was based on the principle of attrition, aiming to wear down the enemy through superior firepower and technology. However, this strategy was hampered by several factors. The Vietcong and North Vietnamese forces, using guerrilla warfare tactics and deep knowledge of the local terrain, were able to avoid large-scale confrontations and instead conducted hit-and-run attacks. They also had the support of much of the rural population, which the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces struggled to win over. The U.S. military faced other challenges, including the difficult terrain of Vietnam's jungles and mountains, as well as the complex political situation in South Vietnam. Corruption, instability, and a lack of popular support plagued the South Vietnamese government, which was seen by many Vietnamese as a puppet of the U.S. One of the most significant events of the war was the Tet Offensive in 1968. The North Vietnamese and Vietcong forces launched a series of coordinated attacks on cities and military bases across South Vietnam during the Vietnamese New Year, Tet. Although the offensive was ultimately a military defeat for the Communists, it was a psychological blow to the U.S. and its allies. The widespread images of the fighting, especially the attack on the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, shattered the public perception that the U.S. was winning the war and led to a significant shift in American public opinion. As the war dragged on with no clear end in sight, opposition to the war grew in the United States. The anti-war movement, which began on college campuses in the early 1960s, expanded into a broad-based movement that included civil rights activists, religious leaders, and everyday Americans. Images of the war's brutality, including the widespread use of napalm and the My Lai massacre in 1968, further fueled opposition. President Richard Nixon, who took office in 1969, implemented a policy of Vietnamization, which aimed to reduce American involvement by transferring more of the fighting to South Vietnamese forces. However, he also expanded the war into neighboring Cambodia and Laos in an effort to cut off North Vietnamese supply lines, leading to further controversy and protests. Most notably the Kent State shootings in 1970. In January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, leading to the withdrawal of U.S. combat troops. However, fighting between North and South Vietnam continued. In April 1975, North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, effectively ending the war and reunifying the country under communist control. The Vietnam War had profound consequences for both Vietnam and the United States. In Vietnam, millions of people were killed, and the country was left devastated by years of warfare. For the U.S., the war led to deep divisions in society and disillusionment with the government, particularly regarding its foreign policy. The war also led to significant changes in U.S. military and diplomatic policies, including the end of the draft and the adoption of a more cautious approach to military interventions. The Vietnam War remains one of the most controversial conflicts in American history and continues to shape U.S. foreign policy debates to this day.